And welcome back to Digital Dialectics. I am Jonathan Herzog, and we are so lucky to have two geniuses in their own right joining us today. We have Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, and we have Glen, Weyl. Welcome to the both of you. I'll give a brief introduction about the two rock stars, the all-stars that we are so lucky to have in conversation today. For anyone who doesn't know, Vitalik is the founder of Ethereum, a global open source platform for decentralized application, the world's most valued and recognized cryptocurrency after Bitcoin, and founder of Bitcoin Magazine. It's the foundation for a new era of the internet where money and payments are built in, where users can own their data. Everyone has access to an open financial system. It's the world's programmable blockchain. Vitalik's received countless recognition and awards for his innovation, from the Teal Fellowship to the World Technology Award, and on and on and on. Glen Weyl is a political economist and social technologist for Microsoft's Office of the Chief Technology Officer and founder of Radical Exchange Foundation. He was valedictorian at Princeton, has a AB, MA, and PhD in economics, and again has gotten countless awards and recognition, including 50 most influential people by Bloomberg Business Week. So without further ado, thank you so much to the both of you for your excellence and innovation and for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you, Jonathan.
Yeah, good to be here. Thank you for inviting us.
Fantastic. So the goal at the outset is to bridge some of the silos in this moment of crisis on top of crisis on top of crisis. And really at the nexus point of political economy, mechanism design, and creating new policy alternatives. So I want to just start out with the current context we're in, which is we're in the midst of this global pandemic. We're in the midst of now wide-scale protests and riots of police brutality in the United States. And we're in the midst of this crisis of epistemology, as has been put. This crisis of market power, of market concentration. And George Packer recently wrote, "Trust is missing everywhere. We're in this crisis and a failure of trust in institutions and in systems." So I want to kick it off to the both of you amidst this backdrop, amidst the context in which we find ourselves. Start.
Yeah, any initial question, any initial prompts to start us off?
Absolutely. So Vitalik, how do you see Ethereum and blockchain technology in particular as a way forward, as a bridge in the context of this trustless society and of a collapse of trust in our institutions? I know you introduced this thread recently on Twitter on Bitcoin as sort of peaceful protest being insufficient, where fixing the monetary system you find insufficient. So if you could elaborate on that thread, which spoke to the importance of decentralized governance more generally.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I guess to kind of zoom out a bit, the value of creating these decentralized and trustless systems in general, right, is that, first of all, we're living in the 21st century, and in the 21st century, people cooperate over the internet and in very large groups and across very diverse groups for people from different walks of life, different professions, different backgrounds, different countries, especially. And we gain a lot from the fact that we have all of these kind of large groups of people, often large groups of kind of institutions cooperating. But at the same time, there is this kind of known problem and this known risk that if you create some kind of large network for people to cooperate, but this network is kind of controlled by one single actor, then that one single actor can do a lot of nasty things with that control, right? Like they can kind of exercise monopoly power, and they can basically extract a lot of resources from participants in the system. sometimes transparently, sometimes totally not transparently. They can grow the network and invite people with one set of rules and then suddenly change the rules to suit themselves better halfway through. If whoever runs the network is based in some country, then they are beholden to that country's political environment. And right now, on top of the kind of crisis of legitimacy of kind of corporate institutions, we also have this kind of crisis of legitimacy of many kinds of governments. And so that's also a problem if you want to build something that works internationally. And so the challenge here is basically kind of, can we create systems that allow large groups of people to cooperate without having that downside of some kind of centralized or trusted actor having to be in the middle, right? So,
So Jonathan, I have a little bit of a different way of formulating this that I'm not sure Vitalik would actually disagree with, but which is a bit different than the way that the usual narrative goes, which is that I don't actually think that trustless is a meaningful concept. I think that the meaningful concept is that we have more diffuse and complicated and surprising paths of trust. The reality is that while people have stopped trusting the government or certain large corporations, though not all, they still have a lot of trust in their neighbors. They still have a lot of trust in people in their network. They still have a lot of trust in a number of relationships and communities that they participate in. And those communities in turn have trust relationships with each other. And we've often taken the shortcut of just representing that complex network of trust by some like big blob called the US government or a big blob called some particular corporation, kind of collapsing a whole network into one big circle rather than representing all the richness of those connections. And we learned from the internet what a mistake that is. The whole idea of the TCP/IP protocol was how much more robust it is if you have multiple pathways through which information can flow, because it's far harder to disrupt that. And somehow we didn't build into that the notion of trust flowing through those pathways. And my hope is that that's what we can reconstruct, not a trustless society, actually a society with much more different kinds of trust, and not residing all of our trust in a very small number of people, which is really the same as residing power in a very small number of people.
Yeah, no, I definitely fully agree with that kind of way of expanding on things.
Now, your collision in particular is fascinating. And I'd love to kind of unfold the development and now the unfolding of this whole field of mechanism design and quadratic funding as applied to blockchain and the Ethereum Foundation's governance, but also in terms of thinking about on a broader macro level, if we look at the US federal government and the need for a great rebuild and the need for development of massive public works and common goods and public infrastructure. And Glen, you've introduced a number of ideas in radical markets like common ownership, self-assessed taxation, and quadratic funding that can help get us out of this rut and offer a new way forward. So I'd love to have you kind of explain to us the insight and the value there, and then how the two of you kind of collided to then apply that to blockchain and cryptocurrencies.
Well, the way I think about it is that on the one hand, there's this huge distrust of many existing institutions and a huge distrust of the idea that the people who are in charge of those from the top down giving orders is a good representation of people's interests. On the other hand, there's a very clear recognition that more than ever in the time of COVID, the problems that we face are collective, not individual. And that if we each try to protect ourselves rather than protecting some notion of the public, it's like, trying to replace the military with a bunch of bodyguards guarding individual buildings. So I think both of those things are recognized at the same time, and those seem to be a contradiction to each other. And really the essence of radical markets, radical exchange, a lot of this is trying to find ways to reconcile those notions, trying to find ways to have public good-oriented mechanisms that don't come from the top of some pre-existing, historically determined, fairly arbitrary structure down to everyone else, but instead grow out of the up-to-the-minute social relations that actually exist among people that generate trust and generate value. And quadratic funding is one way of doing that. It's a way of matching contributions by individuals towards public goods in whatever community people self-determine they want to contribute to, sort of like would happen on a Kickstarter campaign, but with matching funds from a philanthropist or government, or eventually from some sort of a mechanism. Quadratic voting is a way of doing that for making collective decisions where you don't have to sort of predetermine who exactly is in the voting environment. Instead, it emerges from the way that people choose to vote and behave. Common ownership self-assessed tax is a way of sort of, again, allowing people the freedom to express what they value and at the same time returning that value to a common pool that's held by many people. So those are just a few examples. There's many others, but all of these ideas are about this notion that we can actually have more effective collective action if it's not based around rigid and arbitrary historical institutions.
And then how did this world, Glen, then become bridged with yours, Vitalik? And how did this then become integrated into your development of decentralized governance structures for Ethereum itself?
And I guess, so one way to kind of describe this intellectual journey, right, is that, like, first of all, there is kind of blockchains and cryptocurrencies, and specifically what blockchains and cryptocurrencies do. But then there's also kind of the movement that exists around blockchains and around cryptocurrencies, right? And if the movement has existed pretty much ever since even Bitcoin existed. And it's been a movement that's kind of very interested in kind of discussing and thinking about like very radical and different ways of organizing society pretty much almost since the beginning, right? Like even back in 2010 to 2013, it was, if you go to the Bitcoin forums and you go to kind of the politics and society section, you would always find people arguing about like libertarianism and socialism and like in this kind of society, how you would solve this problem. And there'd be all of these kind of really interesting discussions, right? And I kind of got interested in what was then the Bitcoin space, and in part because I was already interested in those topics. And just thinking about things like economics, for example, and it's valuable kind of both because blockchains are economic systems and they're secured by economics in an important way, but also because like you need things like economics and other kind of ways of thinking about people and how groups of people behave in order to figure out what even makes sense to build on top of a blockchain, right? And so those two kind of threads, like one thread being like, how do we make the technology better? And the second thread being like, let's think about things that can be built on top of it, like kind of kept on growing in parallel, right? And when I first learned about radical markets, and I kind of got introduced to Glen, and I found a lot of the ideas really interesting. And I also found that they were kind of applicable to a lot of the problems that even the blockchain space itself is facing, right? Like, so like, for example, open source software, it's been having problems kind of funding public goods pretty much since the beginning, right? Because open source software ultimately is a public good. I publish a piece of code and like, I can't control who can download it and who can't. You just kind of publish it and it's available to everyone. And so, there's a very natural alignment there.
And you actually recently really tested many of these hypotheses with the Gitcoin grant rounds. And so I'm wondering if you could share some of your insights from actually having applied, because now we've seen the Colorado legislature and then also you in the Gitcoin grants actually put some of these ideas, test them empirically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like what we basically did, right, and I guess just kind of zoom out a bit, I'll just explain quadratic funding a bit more in case anyone doesn't know about quadratic funding, which I'm sure a lot of people don't. So the idea behind quadratic funding is basically it's this kind of mechanism for basically directing a pool of funding toward public goods. And the way that it works is basically that you allow anyone to set up a project, right? So like I could, for example, set up a project and say, like, I am renovating this park, please donate money to me. Or I am translating the Ethereum blog into Swahili and I'm publishing my translations here, please donate money to me. And then anyone has the ability to don't contribute money to any project. But then if you have multiple people contribute money to the same project, then basically what happens is that a subsidy gets added on to those donations from the subsidy pool, right? So every time you have a project that multiple people donate to, kind of the theory behind this is that if multiple people donate to a project, that means that that's a project that benefits multiple people, which is the definition of a public good. And so normally there is this kind of tragedy of the commons where a lot of people have the motivation to kind of just sit out and let everyone else donate because the projects ultimately are going to be open to anyone regardless of who pays, and so everyone kind of contributes less than would be optimal. And so this subsidy pool is there to kind of counteract that, right? So basically if 5 people donate, then or more people donate, this extra subsidy pool kind of money from it gets taken and added on top. And the more people that donate, the larger the subsidy is, and it's kind of quadratic, right? So if say 10 people donate $1 each, the subsidy might be $100. If 30 people donate $1 each, the subsidy might be $900. And they're kind of theoretically speaking, this is kind of a mathematically optimal way of like basically choosing where to kind of direct any extra funding that you have toward public goods. And so we deployed this within the context of the Ethereum community, and this kind of extra subsidy pool came from people like the Ethereum Foundation, Consensus, myself, a few other people. And we let people like basically spin up projects and direct some money toward them using this quadratic funding mechanism. And it actually works quite well. Like thousands of people participated. There were some interesting projects. There were a lot of projects that kind of bubbled up and got supported through the mechanism that like the Ethereum Foundation itself didn't even realize the community found valuable. And so in general, it was pretty successful, and we ended up learning a lot.
Absolutely. And now, in the context, Glen, of your vision of kind of radical markets and fundamentally altering the revenue streams for the federal government, right? Because one of the kind of misconceptions of this era is that we don't have the resources, right? We don't have the resources to fund public infrastructure. We don't have the resources to establish any foundation of the common good. So kind of zooming out from the context of the Gitcoin grants, how do you see this application on the legislative level when it comes to either the municipal financing budgets you proposed or even on the federal level? Because I think this really intimately ties into your idea of commonly owned or collectively owned property. And can you kind of walk us through what that might look like in practice, and why people should care, why this really critical idea matters to them?
Yeah, so I'll give you a concrete example that's a little bit of a hot button, which is that many people have probably read that Donald Trump inherited from his father some land, which I think was for tax purposes valued at like $1 million, but turns out to have a year later sold for $400 million, right? And this was very controversial because it obviously seemed like he was dodging taxes. But I think it actually goes to a deeper problem, which is not just about dodging or not dodging taxes. A wealth tax, like a lot of people on the left have advocated, and there's a lot of good reasons to support a wealth tax, is simply unworkable in the way that most people have advocated. And pretty much every country that has tried it has failed to enforce it. Because the problem is that much, if not most, wealth is held in private companies that are not publicly traded, and or is subjectively valued by the current owner at much greater than any, quote, market value, which doesn't really exist anyways, because there's only a few people who could make use of the thing in any case. And therefore, we just don't get, like, a wealth tax just will not capture most wealth in a standard administration by somebody going in and evaluating things and people paying a tax on that. So if you want to have a wealth tax, you need some way to get people to be honest about what the value of the property is. And I think the best way to do that is that they have to offer to sell the property at the price at which they assess it. Now that sounds really brutal to people. That sounds like, oh my God, someone's going to come grab my granny's house. But if you just think about the levels at which wealth taxes are usually discussed, like Elizabeth Warren said, above $50 million. So what everyone could have is a $50 million exemption. You pay no taxes. You can value all your possessions at $50 million. People can take everything but, let's say, a primary residence or some exemption if they pay you $50 million. But beyond that, if you want to protect things so that they can only be taken at a price greater than that, you have to value them yourself. This, I think, is a wealth tax that would actually raise a large amount of revenue, because it would be impossible for people to hide things because they know that they have the credible threat of other people taking that from them. And actually, this is a mechanism that in different forms has been used throughout history. It was used in a form in ancient Athens to collect their wealth tax. It was used by Danish Vikings to collect taxes coming through the Sound. And it's a much more reliable method because it goes to the people who actually know what something is worth and gives them a credible reason to be truthful about it.
I think there's just so much insight and power baked into these ideas. And to your point, you don't have to even look very far. So we're based in New York's 10th district, which is the west side of Manhattan and South Brooklyn. It is ground zero. It is the home to Wall Street, the world's financial capital. You have public housing opposite luxury housing developments that sit largely vacant. And that, to me, was incredibly powerful in the idea of the balance between allocative and investment efficiency that you lay out, where you actually proffer that this could increase the utilization of property so that we don't just have hundreds, thousands of vacant luxury units sitting around a city like Manhattan.
There's a guy named Henry George who I admire very much and who had an idea of what caused the business cycle. I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, Vitalik. I think it's a very interesting idea. But his claim was that, when there's a boom in the economy, what actually causes the bust is baked into the boom, which is that people speculate on property. They buy up the property, but because they're speculating and have nothing to do with the property, they just sit on it. And then because they're sitting on it, basically economic activity goes down because assets that could be utilized get underutilized, and that actually causes a recession. And so I think that that's kind of the paradox, is that I actually, dynamics like that have probably played out much more strongly in the Ethereum community than they have in the real world. But there is sort of a certain sense in which a boom creates its own bust precisely because the speculative dynamics associated with it are antithetical to the very progress upon which that speculation is premised.
No, and that's definitely a really interesting idea. I mean, and I definitely love Henry George as well. I mean, kind of Georgia's land value taxes and kind of more general tax the ingestible, kind of subsidize the public goods.
George was also just an incredible human being. Speaking of New York City, he ran for mayor of New York in 1886 as the first true center-left candidate in American history, because, to that point, the Democrats and the Republicans differed on many things, but not on this traditional, redistributive type dimensions that politics is now about. And he ran for the United Labor Party ticket, which was the first major candidate for a Labor Party ticket in the United States. He came in second place behind the Democrat, but ahead of the Republican, who was Theodore Roosevelt, which was the first major office that Roosevelt had run for. And many people believe that Roosevelt got many of his progressive ideas from being beaten by George on such a platform in the 1880s.
Wow. Fascinating. Really. So I have to ask Vitalik about Ethereum 2.0 and the rollout of the new proof of stake and sharding, and trying to dissect and decipher the Casper FFG paper. If you could kind of break it down and walk through us. I remember you talking about the fork between 50% fault tolerant but dependent on network synchrony versus 33% fault tolerant but safe under asynchrony. So if you could walk us through what this means, what the implications are, and how you're making these decisions as they unfold.
Sure. So Ethereum 2.0, this next major upgrade to Ethereum contains two major parts. One of them is what we call proof of stake, and the other is what we call sharding. So proof of stake is a consensus mechanism. It's a way for the nodes in the blockchain to all agree on basically which transactions came in what order. And it's an alternative to proof of work, which runs Bitcoin and which currently runs Ethereum. So where proof of work basically involves these miners, these computers just constantly running 24/7 and trying to compute hashes. And if you can compute a lucky hash, you have the ability to publish a block and add it to the chain. And we don't like proof of work too much. And first, it has some kind of economic deficiencies in terms of its vulnerability and kind of profitability of certain kinds of attacks. But more importantly, it just burns a huge amount of energy. And if we're building a platform to try to kind of improve and create a better world, building it on top of a base layer that's just pumping a huge amount of CO2 into the atmosphere is something that we want to move away from, right? So proof of stake basically says instead of needing to kind of burn lots of computing power to participate in the system, anyone who has kind of Ether, who has coins inside of the network, has the ability to just basically sign a message with the address that owns those coins in order to kind of start participating in the consensus, right? So basically, proof of work and proof of stake are both kind of economically mediated consensus. So if you have kind of resources, you can participate in the network, except in the proof of work case, it kind of goes through this channel of you buying hardware, and that hardware just running and kind of consuming energy and compute cycles 24/7. Whereas with proof of stake, it's just in the form of your coins that are already sitting there, and you just sign some messages and you help the network kind of stay together. So that's in the kind of the big idea behind proof of stake. And there's also some benefits. So for example, safe under asynchrony, that buzzword basically means that if the network kind of latency temporarily goes very high, so if computers suddenly start talking to each other really slowly, that doesn't compromise the safety of the system. So it doesn't lead to a risk of, say, transactions being reverted in the same way that it would in what's called a longest chain system, which proof of work is an example of. And there's other benefits too, right? So that's proof of stake. Sharding is a scalability technique. So basically, the problem with blockchains today is that because with a blockchain today, every computer in the network needs to process every transaction. The scalability of the network can only be basically the same as the scalability of one computer, right? Because whatever the transactions in the network are, that one computer is going to process them all. And sharding basically says, well, instead of that, how about we kind of split up the work and we require each computer to only have to process a small portion of the transactions. And so every transaction still gets processed by many computers, except instead of being, say, 100,000, it might be 1,000, right? And so the scalability of the system could go up by, say, a factor of 100 or more. Now, so that's sharding, and sharding is still kind of a bit of a ways away. But even before that, there is more kind of exciting Ethereum scaling news, which is kind of layer 2 scaling solutions, right? So basically, techniques that try to use kind of cryptography in clever ways in order to compute and do most of the work of verifying transactions off-chain and publish a kind of relatively small amount of data and a relatively small amount of cryptographic proofs that say everything was done correctly on-chain. And so optimistic rollup, ZK rollup, Plasma are kind of some of the names of these techniques, and they can push the scalability of Ethereum up from where it is today, which is around 10 to 30 transactions a second, up to about 1,000 to 3,000 transactions a second. And some of these systems are already live. So, lots of good work happening on Ethereum scaling, and I'm really looking forward to kind of larger scale applications happening on the platform.
So let's kind of scale up for a moment. And if we imagine this universe where if you could wave your kind of magic wand and institute the federal policy that would enable, so let's say we have recognition of data dignity and we have some return of a data dividend as Glen has proposed. And not to speak for you, but we're all basically working and laboring for Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Uber, and the like, uncompensated. And let's say, so we can map out this kind of universe. Let's say we have a universal basic income. Again, if you could wave this magic wand in the context of American federal governance, what might that be? What are those key kind of linchpins or nodes, ideas or policies? One thing that's been proposed, for example, hand in hand with the universal basic income, the guaranteed minimum income, is some sort of cryptocurrency-based trust fund that can ensure that most people have some sort of savings, because we're in the United States, where before COVID, half of all Americans couldn't afford an unexpected $500 bill. Most people had no savings whatsoever. So again, just kind of zooming out for a moment and thinking about what you might do if you could wave that magic wand.
So I'm not a magic wand waver. That's not the way I believe in behaving. I think that people like me and Vitalik have some really important specific insights on specific areas that we've had the time to devote ourselves to thinking about, that we can add to people, but that any system that's not co-created by the people who are actually going to live it is not going to be one worth living in. And, the American Republic did not come from a revolution in the standard sense. It came from a much more powerful phenomenon, which is ideas spreading, people living those ideas. And then over time, as the ideas were lived, those ideas becoming formalized at higher levels and replacing existing forms of authority. So I believe in additive, not subtractive modes of creating new ways of living. I think if we can build systems that are better and that people feel hope in, that gradually the other systems will come to seem anachronistic. They'll never entirely fade, just like British still have a monarchy, but they'll become less and less relevant. And that's what I would like to see. I think it could, speculatively bring, great benefits, much greater, more equal distribution of wealth, much greater feeling of control that people would have over their lives, a feeling of equality, not just in the economic sense, but equality in the sense of voice and influence over the things that matter to you. But that will only happen if it is not just people like us who wave a wand, but if everyone takes the responsibility for forging the life that they want to live together.
Yeah, and I think I definitely agree with a lot of that as well. And I think, one of the things that we learned from the Gitcoin grants trials, for example, and you could argue that it's also a thing that people have learned from many other contexts as well, like even like U.S. foreign policy, for example, is that it's not enough to just kind of install a new set of rules like over a group of people. In order for a set of rules to work, you also have to have a culture that kind of works around those rules. And so, like in the case of quadratic funding, for example, like as we did the experiments in Gitcoin grants, we saw that, okay, you have this mechanism and people can start kind of creating projects and people can start donating money to them. But like it took a few rounds for it to kind of really kind of get into gear, right? And it took a few rounds for people to kind of start to actually understand, how exactly does this mechanism work? Like what exactly are some of these dynamics? Like what kinds of projects are people kind of supposed to use the system for? If someone puts a certain kind of project, then what kinds of approaches make sense in terms of like how much people should contribute, and how do people kind of promote their projects? How do people respond to other people promoting their projects, and all of these little ideas. And if this kind of higher level kind of cultural operating system didn't have the ability to develop, then the quadratic funding by itself would possibly not even work all that well, right? It would just be like a bunch of people throwing money around, and they would not even necessarily have any idea of like does this project deserve like $209 or does it deserve $453? Like, how do you even know, right? And yeah, but if you do have all of these norms, which can only form if you actually do have a community of people that's kind of participates in this mechanism and kind of deeply and internally understands why it's good for them, then you actually do get kind of all of these things forming on top, and you actually get your mechanism of leading to what you want, which is outcomes that even you could not have predicted.
And how would you say, Vitalik, the role of quantum computing might play in terms of cryptography for the Ethereum blockchain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good question there. And I think a lot of people have this kind of misconception about quantum computers, that a quantum computer is this kind of magic machine that makes P equal NP and that basically breaks all the cryptography. This is not true. Right, so quantum computers have a few specific algorithms. So Shor's algorithm and Grover's algorithm are two of the most common ones that can break very specific forms of cryptography, and they can perform very specific kinds of calculations faster than existing computers can. And so there are some types of some types of cryptography that stop working, right? That become very easily breakable. And unfortunately, the cryptography that we commonly use today, so particularly anything involving factoring, RSA, or hidden order groups or elliptic curves, which unfortunately is like a lot, right? Like Bitcoin and Ethereum brought in elliptic curves, ends up not working. But for every piece where we can know quantum computers will break it, we already, and for a long time, have known of alternatives that are quantum resistant, right? So we've known about, like, for example, hash-based signature schemes, so digital signature schemes that rely only on hashes, and hashes are quantum proof, so you can't like break a hash, you can't cause a collision or a pre-image even with a quantum computer. For encryption, we have replacements based on isogenies and based on lattices. For even zero knowledge proofs, like the things that Zcash and like some of the recent Ethereum stuff runs on, we have Starks, which are also based entirely on hashes. So it's definitely not an existential threat. It is an upgrade process that we will be forced to go through eventually, and it's still quite a bit of time away. So I think for now, we're definitely very safe.
Now, Glen, we're living in a system where our federal government still runs floppy disks, where you've been on the forefront at the vanguard of the call for basic testing at scale, for basic contact tracing at scale, and looking to systems in Taiwan and South Korea that have been able to do as much. I mean, we're talking about a system as well that defunded the Office of Technology Assessment nearly 2.5 decades ago. I mean, how do we even begin at the outset in a system that hasn't grappled with the technologies really since the dot-com bubble?
Well, I mean, I think one key to it is not talking about technology as technology, but technology is what it can actually do for people. To show lived examples of how in Taiwan, technology meant more democracy, not more surveillance, not more centralized control. Because many people are techno-skeptics. In fact, our society is overrun by techno-skepticism. I was talking to someone today who said that, the cypherpunk thing, where you were supposed to be, cyberpunk thing, where you're supposed to be sort of skeptical of what technology was going to do, started out as a counterculture, but now is like the default position of most people in our society. And as long as that is the image of the future of technology, we're going to lose, because we're not going to be able to keep up with societies like the Chinese that are able to cope with changes. And B, we're going to miss out on the opportunity to live much more inclusive, democratic, participatory lives, because we live lives at scale. We live lives where we interact with people who are distant. And if we shy away from harnessing technology for those things, we'll be harnessed by technology. Maybe not our technology, maybe not our government, it'll be too disorganized, but someone is going to find the means to own and control that stuff. And gradually, whatever systems are unable to keep up with it will, fall away. And you'll end up with the domination of Facebook, with the domination of the Chinese state, with the domination of whoever is able to master the techniques that we've chosen to write off as inherently dystopian rather than claim for the values we all share.
And what, towards that end, towards that alternative path forward, if you were to say the kind of high points of variance to move our society in that direction, in terms of
stories. I think stories are the most important thing. I think of Marvel Comics. I think Marvel is one of the most powerful, set of narratives. It is a single universe with a million different entry points from all its different characters, each of which speaks to a different element of how people live. And that gives it the capacity to be pluralistic and yet still have an underlying truth. And we need stories like that about what's happened in Taiwan and the way that they've created an incredibly vibrant digital democracy, what they're doing in Estonia, and imagination of what we could do here. There's enough Black Mirror. We need much more attempts to actually find a way, appreciate the weaknesses of technology, and nonetheless find a way to claim it for ourselves. Science fiction writers like Ted Chiang, people in many different areas of society can join us in that project.
Now, sorry, go ahead, Vitalik.
No, I was just going to say, I definitely agree with the point on stories. I posted a message on Twitter, I think about a month or two ago, where basically kind of pointed out that, hey, pretty much all of the science fiction that we have today is dystopian. And, someone asked, well, do you remember even a single non-dystopian kind of major movie from a sci-fi movie from the last decade or even 2 decades? And I basically, the first thing I could come up with is The Wandering Earth, which, of course, comes from China.
There is an example, Vitalik, from the US, and it's based on Ted Chiang's work, Arrival. Have you seen Arrival?
Oh, yes, I have. No, you're right.
It's not utopian, but it's exactly, I think, in the right tone, which is to say it imagines ways in which technology works out only to the extent that we engage our humanity with it,
Yeah. Now, in the context of this diversity and the richness of our shared humanity, as you've put it, Glenn, how do we, we're working to advance systems that carry immense complexity, mathematical complexity, system design, mechanism design, and in the communication and the application, it seems critical that what Unger calls inclusive vanguardism, right, where the further developments in blockchain, in Ethereum, how do we bridge that gap and make it more accessible and inclusive to have a bridge towards that future you're envisioning, that everyone can see themselves have a part in?
Well, we need movements that are not just movements of technologists. We need movements that are movements of political activists in conversation with technologists, in conversation with academics, in conversation with people from the arts and people from really all across our society. It's only if we develop what I would call design in a democratic spirit, where we actually judge our technologies by what they mean to the people that we create them for, rather than what they mean to the designer's class, are we going to be able to, overcome both the corruption that we see and include others in the co-creation of these new worlds.
And in your own experience, Vitalik, how have you found, in the context of decentralized governance and in the context of the Ethereum Foundation and the whole community you've really built from the ground up, how have you seen that kind of evolution over the past number of years as that community has grown?
Yeah, and I think one of the really powerful things about the blockchain space is that you're not just talking about ideas. You have context within which you can actually go ahead and implement them, right? And the kind of community that existed around blockchains before. I mean, it's definitely had a lot of time to kind of argue the details of various kinds of new social arrangements in theory land. But when you're just in theory land, like you're not really aware of like what all of these kind of real world variables are, right? And like you might say that, oh, this thing looks theoretically optimal, but that optimality is always based on some set of assumptions. And are those assumptions actually true? Well, sometimes yes, and sometimes no, and sometimes you don't even know ahead of time. And so, like, just to go back to this sort of Gitcoin grants example, like we actually had a chance to basically try this quadratic funding mechanism out in the context of the Ethereum community, and it works really well. And we also learned things, and our learnings have led to adjustments, sometimes kind of adjustments to the mechanism, sometimes adjustments to the user interface and how we present the mechanism, and it kind of co-evolves together with the people, right? And in quadratic funding isn't even the only example. I mean, there have been lots of kind of trials of different kinds of governance experiments within the crypto space, some successful and many have been, and I would consider epic failures. And at the end of the day, we learn from both. So I think that just ability to just try out different systems and experiment with systems within the context of communities that are excited about it and interested in adopting these systems, but at the same time actually do need something to kind of support their needs is really powerful.
Now, in the context of decentralization, I'm curious to hear both of your visions for the partial centralization versus total decentralization, and mathematically enforced decentralization. And again, looking at from my lens, kind of my bias is the United States federal government, and our current monetary system and the hyper centralized mechanisms of governance. But how do you kind of think about that balance in the context of Ethereum, perhaps by contrast to Bitcoin, let's say?
It's sorry. So how do I think about what balance in Ethereum in contrast to Bitcoin?
The sort of partial
centralization and kind of how the political economy.
Yeah.
Right, and how the political economy of the ecosystem works. Yeah. Right. So one thing that's interesting about kind of the cypherpunk and crypto land, right, and it's this interesting irony that I've mentioned on quite a few occasions now, is that on the one hand, it's this kind of ideology that, I mean, somewhat less so now, but like definitely kind of 15 to 20 years ago at the beginning, really valued things like kind of free markets, payments, kind of these censorship, kind of resistant communication, and technologies that enable kind of more efficient one-to-one interactions. But at the same time, like all of these systems, and especially blockchains, and the infosphere in general, is a space where like you pretty much have more public goods than private goods, right? And technology is like money and finance, and evolved primarily in the context of kind of helping people get access to private goods more efficiently, right? Like when markets tend to be more efficient when it's like, I'm selling you an Apple or I'm selling you services, like something rivalrous where if I have it, you don't have it. And it's like kind of a relationship between one buyer and one seller. But on the internet, it's like I write a blog post and publish it, it's immediately available to everyone. I write a piece of code, publish it, it's immediately available to everyone. Like pretty much nothing on the internet is one-to-one, and pretty much everything on the internet is like 1 to 1,000 or 1 to 1,000,000. And so the irony here is basically that it kind of started off working with these social technologies that, like when you look at their economics, are really optimized for kind of one-to-one interactions, but at the same time, their environment is one that has is dominated by like one-to-many interactions. And so like both the Bitcoin and the Ethereum community have had to kind of grapple with this reality in different ways. So public goods within blockchain ecosystems, there's a lot of them. And if one of the really big ones is, of course, network security. So kind of who pays for all of these nodes that are participating in securing the network. And one of the nice things, of course, with network security in particular, of course, is that network kind of how a node participates in the network is measurable. And so it's fairly easy to programmatically incentivize. And so you just say, if you mine a block, you get 12.5 Bitcoins. If you mine an Ethereum block, you get 2 Ether. If you mine an Uncle, you get 1.75 Ether or whatever it is. And then you have transaction fees. And so like that one particular public good, which is security, you just kind of fund it from the network. But then you have all these other public goods, right? Like protocol development, research, marketing.
And Vitalik, but I would say even the example that you gave where it's programmed in, that was programmed in by someone. And so to the extent that like the network works at all, it's because there was some evil centralized entity, probably named Vitalik or one of Vitalik's friends, who like programmed that in, right? And so like everything, it's not like you get around the problem simply by having like one person do some subset of the thing,
Yes. Yeah. And I think like the difference kind of is, right, that security is like one single thing, and you can kind of have this kind of meeting of people at the beginning, and you figure it out at the beginning, and you and then it kind of goes on. And like if you look at kind of early political economic theories of what government is supposed to do, right? Like you would see Venn diagrams that say, if you're an anarcho-capitalist, you believe the government should do exactly nothing. If you're a minarchist, you believe it should run kind of the military. If you're a level 2 minarchist, you add in firefighters and the police. If you're a level 3 minarchist, you add a couple of other things. If you're a socialist, you add like many more things. And so the core underlying assumption in this kind of model is that the set of public goods that matter to people actually can be enumerated like within this kind of particular set, right? And when we tried doing that for private goods, that ended up being called communism, and it worked like terribly, right? And so in the context of public goods, like, okay, security is one, but then there's others, and like they change over time, and you don't even know what they will be ahead of time. And so grappling with the kind of how to fund these other public goods that people have, and where you just have new ones that keep on popping up from time to time, and it's a challenge, right? Like there's like, do you kind of try to add in protocol features where people kind of vote for where to kind of send funding for public goods? Like, do you have some kind of foundation? Do you have a hybrid? Do you have some collection of different entities? And there's even also questions of like who runs the code, who has authority over publishing the code. And like the Bitcoin ecosystem takes one approach, which is more kind of minimalist and relies on the kind of basically corporate volunteer effort in some sense. And in the Ethereum case, you have the Ethereum Foundation along with some other entities. In the case of Zcash, you have the Zcash company and the foundation as organizations that receive money from kind of directly from the protocol. In kind of Decred, you have voting. So there's a lot of different options, and we're trying all of them.
And now, Glen, you've kind of really grounded this very concretely and enlighteningly, I think, in the context of applying, I think, kind of mechanism designed to the sale of online advertising. And I'd love if you can kind of break that down a little bit and explain, because this is eminently applicable and not even just theoretical. This happens in practice right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite funny. A lot of people object to the, hyper auctionized nature of, the common ownership self-assessed tax that we discuss in many contexts, but then they think, oh, it's completely fine that online advertisements would be sold every second to whoever has the highest bid. And then people are like, well, that's totally different. Well, it's not actually different. The reality is that people make investments in brand names. And if your brand name can be expropriated by whoever bids the next thing, it's the exact same problem as your building being taken. But we've gone to the opposite extreme, much further than the common ownership self-assessed tax would do. So actually, I favor more property rights in the context of online advertisement, because there's no property rights at all. And actually, I think we need to reform those things in the direction of giving more rights to the copyright holders or the partial copyright holders of different terms online. So our society, it's always challenging to see the underlying principles. We get used to one principle being used in one place and another principle being used in another. People are fine with the notion that some people are complete renters, and like at any time the rent could go up and they could be forced out of their apartment. And yet they're not okay with the notion of people being partial renters because it's unfamiliar. So I think that all these things are illustrating how much broader the possibilities are than what we've allowed ourselves to imagine in the past.
And in terms of what the mechanics actually look like in practice, I mean, just to kind of ground it, what does this constant public auction sort of look like in practice?
Well, it would depend on context. I think eventually it would not be, and this is an area where we might disagree a little bit, not be universal. Or completely open. I actually prefer versions of this that are within particular communities. And in fact, I think the term universal basic income is very misleading because no one is actually proposing a universal basic income. First of all, we don't know if there are other sentient life off this planet. So universal basic income is already sort of ruled out. But even within humans on Earth, no one is actually saying we give the same income to everyone around the planet. What you're really saying is a national American basic income. But to me, the nation state is not the only relevant community. There are many other communities. And what I'd really like to see is many incomes that people have that come from many sources of collective ownership. And I'd love to see these rights to purchase exist within those communities and maybe in slightly different or less strong forms outside of those communities. And I think when you start thinking about things in those terms, you realize that both the system would be much more elaborate, is not one that can be a magic wand waved and us decide. It would be built up through many communities experimenting with these ideas and making them their own and succeeding by using them.
So I want to take us for a moment to what I thought was a really powerful thread you posted recently, Vitalik. And it's very apropos in this moment because with the Genesis block and the founding in the wake of the financial crisis more than a decade ago, you kind of drew this contrast between the idea and the vision of Bitcoin as itself being peaceful protest, but also suggesting that the current crisis we face is not just a financial one. And in the context of the United States, even though we've entered a version of a new Great Depression, more than 40 million are unemployed, more than 100,000 are dead, Congress has been on recess, but it only returned to session to inject essentially $1.5 trillion into the capital markets. But I'd really love, because again, this kind of crisis on top of a crisis on top of a crisis, if you could help us kind of unfold and unravel what you meant in terms of the implications for this not just being a financial crisis.
Sure. And so, and I think, first of all, if we just kind of look at the situation that kind of we have worldwide today, right? I mean, first of all, you have the virus, and the virus, and it definitely hits you more if you're poor, but it ultimately hits people rich and poor. The techniques that have with which you deal with the virus, and like you can't just print money and make the virus go away, and you also can't just give people hard money and make the virus go away, right? Like the techniques to deal with the virus just have to do with epidemiological stuff and like some combination of like treatment, tracing, social distancing, and like whatever combination of these other techniques that you want to use. So we have a virus crisis. Then we have an epistemology crisis, right? So a crisis of just how do we learn things? How do we learn what's true? How do we learn what's important? How do we learn kind of what we should emphasize us thinking about? And there's been a lot of kind of distrust of authorities, distrust of even like mainstream media experts, also distrust of social media, distrust of like pretty much any a kind of collaborative mechanism for learning things that exist today. And ultimately, we do have to learn collaboratively if we want to continue escaping the Stone Age. And so, like, we do want to have kind of better ways in which we can learn from each other collaboratively that don't have some of the failure modes, right? So that's the second crisis. And third crisis is on top of this, kind of obviously the whole situation involving police brutality and kind of the protests that are resulting from that. And like things like protests, right, they kind of follow very different dynamics from kind of many kinds of economic theories, right? So like many kinds of economic theories, they rely on kind of equilibria, and they rely on these models that are kind of mathematically well behaved in a certain sense, and you can analyze them, and like you say, oh, if the price elasticity is 3, then if this parameter goes down by x, then this other parameter goes up by 3x, kind of approximately. And like they are kind of tractable in that sense. But I mean, protests, like for example, I mean, even I think like revolutions are one of the kind of canonical examples of a chaotic phenomenon, right? Like you also like what we have now, kind of whether it's kind of smaller kind of cascades on social media, whether it's kind of protests in the physical world, whether it's kind of actual changes that happen as a result of them. Like these are very chaotic phenomena, and it's like very small changes to initial conditions can lead to very large changes, often even like a day in the future. And so the tools for kind of modeling with these things, dealing with these things are kind of very different from what they were before. So basically, and the set of challenges that we're kind of going into just from multiple ways is kind of very different from the set of challenges that kind of we had in this kind of previous decade or so. I mean, there are a lot of things that are shared. Financial aspects still exist. Even financial systems have their own share of chaos theory inside of them. But kind of the way that you model them, the way that you think about these things, the way that you think about how to fix these problems, like it involves fairly different kinds of tools. And so like we can't just like basically keep on playing to the same tune that we've been kind of playing for all of these years and expect to keep saying things that are correct, right? Like we have to keep coming up with new ideas and new solutions too.
Yeah, and I think this is what I find so inspiring and moving and fantastic just about the nexus and intersection of the two of you in terms of being good stewards of this new economics, right? This new paradigm that we haven't wrapped our minds around by any stretch of the imagination. So I want to give you a chance, to respond, Glenn.
Well, I would just second what Vitalik said about you can't just print money and get, the disease to go away. This one thing I found really frustrating, and actually what got me responding to COVID, was that all the economists were saying, oh, print money, like government stimulus. And I was like, what exactly are people going to do with their government stimulus? They can't go out on the streets. Like, where are they going to go and spend that money precisely? What is it that you think is going to happen, other than that there are going to be some companies, which are the only people who can absorb that money, that are going to go up in value? Like, it's like literally, it's just mechanically, you look at the system and the only possible sink for money is basically a few big tech companies. And so then people are surprised that the tech companies went up in value while the whole economy went down. And it's like, well, the money went to the only sink that existed, and maybe people saved some, you know what I mean? But there's just like, there's this incredible disconnect where we have this super low dimensional way of thinking about things. And we can't adjust to the fact that, like, yes, that is some axis along which you can cut the world, but it may not be at all the relevant axis for the particular moment. So there's all these economists who should have, the first thing that they did was learn some epidemiology. But instead they were just like, oh, how does this project onto the two-dimensional space of interest rates and like federal government aggregate spending? And in the process, they lost the chance to spend 1/10 as much money, actually fix the epidemiological problem that underlay it. And therefore they got a much bigger problem that they had even less of an idea of how to deal with. So this was really frustrating. And that's really why I got involved in trying to directly respond to the COVID situation.
And now, based on our, I guess, past conversations, it seems like, unfortunately, the United States has largely been asleep at the switch in terms of actually adopting and moving forward on some of those proposals. So how do you,
it's not just the US, it's
Yeah.
a lot of Western Europe
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality is that just blaming Trump is a mistake. I think that the real problem is societies that have this deep divide between the technocrats and populists. Even if the technocrats happen to be in charge like they were in France, that distrust and divide impedes communication. I think if Hillary Clinton had been president, we might have even gotten a worse outcome, because she would have tried to do, quote, the right thing, unquote, and a bunch of people would have concluded that it was an attempt to sort of like abolish the Constitution. And you would have had like a civil uprising that would have spread the virus even more effectively. So the fundamental problem is not Trump, it's what Trump is a symptom of, which is a fundamental distrust and a merited distrust between the wide parts of the public and the people who are allegedly serving them.
And what would you then envision that concrete, tangible alternative being?
Basically, people using a variety of large-scale deliberation and preference expression tools to find collective choices that they can jointly live with. And we've seen that happen. It requires access to a mobile phone, which we have about 75% penetration in the United States. Doesn't really require much more than that. So I think that, these are real lived experiences in places like Taiwan. So I don't see any reason why we as America have to just declare defeat. It's kind of a really depressing situation. It used to be that you would say, well, in America, you could expect X, but if I go to this third world country, I can't expect that sort of service. Now you say, oh, well, they did that in Vietnam. Sure, Vietnam can do that. But there's no way we could pull something like that off in the United States of America. How did we end up in that place where we're so pessimistic about our ability to do the most basic functions of collective organization that we think that even things that they can do in Kerala, India are impossible in the US?
Yeah, to me, it's just something we have to sit with for a moment, really, because I think we haven't fully processed and internalized the depths of the institutional collapse, the fundamental failures of trust and sense of possibility, sense of institutional reconstruction, of collective organizing, of the power beyond ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also just interesting that, and very kind of indicative of the times, that the main positive highlight that the U.S. has seen during these last couple of weeks is the SpaceX launch, which of course is the first ever space launch that's basically run by a corporation. So it's
frankly, the confidence in our governmental institutions has fallen to such a low ebb that in some times I feel that there's a better hope in democratizing and changing the power structure of existing corporations rather than in trying to revivify government. That's one reason that I work at Microsoft is, I'd like to see Microsoft be much more democratically accountable to its stakeholders. And that may actually be a more effective pathway for getting large-scale democracy going than is trying to revivify American democracy, though I certainly haven't given up on that one either.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's kind of important to add on top of this is that one other kind of big error that political economy often makes is that it tries to create this kind of dichotomy where, you have the private space, which is supposed to be run by kind of free markets and private property and corporations, and then you have the public space, which is kind of supposed to be run by a democratic government. And there isn't really much recognition of something in the middle. You have a little bit, you have different levels of government, for example, you have federal, state, and local, but in general, there isn't kind of much explicit recognition, at least whether in a formal rules or even in a kind of culture of this existence of things that are either semi-public or that are kind of public on scales that are somewhere in between one and in your case, kind of 300 million, and ultimately in the world case, kind of 8 billion. So one of the things that quadratic funding does really well is that it kind of allows for this more diverse space, and it allows for kind of people to specialize more and kind of and say like and kind of express their preferences on kind of much more specific things. And I think the world that we want to see is definitely not one that has these kind of monolithic organizations that claim to represent everyone. It's one that's is kind of much more pluralistic and kind of diverse, and can kind of match kind of different constituencies of different sizes in a much more kind of functional way.
Well, I actually think that was a huge problem in our government response, which is that everyone was like, the government should do something. And the question is, what the hell do you mean by the government? And I think people eventually realized that there is no such thing as the government in the United States. There's like a whole range of different organizations, each of which have very carefully balanced and, complicated types of authority. And so there is no like the government to do things. Now, the president as an individual has a lot of coordinating power and could have chosen to help people think through the roles of all these different things in a more clearly coordinated way than he chose to. But there was no government to do this. The CDC has incredibly limited authority. There's no such thing as the government in the United States. And it's even in more centralized countries, there's not really such a thing as the government. There's a million different governments, a million different corporations with different responsibilities, all sorts of civil society organizations that together constitute the forces that jointly coordinate us.
Certainly a very challenging backdrop. I want to really kind of open up to the both of you. One question might be is, it seems there's a lot of intersecting areas of that might keep you up at night. But what might be that thing that really concerns you as that high point of variance for agency, for again, kind of positive stewardship of this new paradigm over which no one seems to really have a grasp over. Just that kind of singular point of exertion that you find yourself consumed with at this moment, that you think we should reorient ourselves towards.
Vitalik, thoughts? Start here.
And feel free to start.
Well, look, my view is that the systems of governance in the West are going to be totally discredited, and the most natural thing is going to be to look to China. And China is not, in this context, really a culture or a country, because, of course, Taiwan is China as well. Chinese have had all sorts of governing philosophies, at least as diverse as those in the West, from versions of Marxism to versions of sort of the most extreme libertarianism in a lot of sort of Taoist thought. So the reality is what China in this context means is a philosophy that's also true in a lot of parts of economics academia, in lots of parts of the public health establishment, in which there's a small group of experts that knows the right way to organize things, and that they figure out the right solution and everybody else just follows along. That's a vision of government that has existed since the time of Plato, the philosopher king, the technocrat. Given how much populists failed, there's going to be a very strong pressure in that direction. And that is what I think we need to resist. We need to instead have a way of imagining how we can collectively co-create systems using insights from people with imagination and expertise, but do it collectively ourselves. How we can have true self-government in all the diversity that means, not of one country, but of systems in general, where we have what I would call symmetry of power. Whenever one group of people or one person has power over others, those people have power over the person. That's a much richer, more complex notion of self-government, but I think that's really the essence of what it means.
And by the mechanism of enforcement there, is that through blockchain technology or through algorithmically determined, mathematical enforcement, or what is the primary mechanism there?
It's through shared and different visions of legitimacy. Look, the notion of human rights, the notion of democracy as we now understand it, are relatively new ideas. They really come out of the Enlightenment and the American Revolution and so forth, and they built up from local communities to broader worlds. And we need, there were good things in that. There were many things that was missing. We need to move beyond those as the fundamental foundations of legitimacy alone. And we need new shared notions of legitimacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from kind of what I can see, and I think there's kind of two simultaneous challenges, where one of the challenges is just kind of dealing with basically the world as it is. Like, quadratic funding is not just going to be adopted across a large country in 2021, and we're not going to be kind of harbinger taxing kind of all of the land or all of the intellectual property of the next year. And there is this kind of dysfunctional global political context that we have to deal with, and that we have to survive in some way. And how we deal with it, and I don't think there's any one answer, and I think there's kind of dozens or hundreds of answers that are kind of specific to the specific subproblem. And then the second question is kind of how do we go toward building out this new world, right? How do we go toward actually taking some of these kind of new governance ideas that we have and actually kind of expanding them out to a much larger groups of people. And I think the second problem we can only solve incrementally, right? Like, you can only just say, look, we'll start trying these ideas out in some context, and this isn't a cryptographic technology. This is a social technology, and so you can't just run a bunch of unit tests in 240 milliseconds and call it a day. You have to actually try it out with groups of people and see the consequences in a lot of different groups of people, make sure that it works in some contexts, try to scale it up more, see how it goes, see what the failures are, learn from the failures, and a very wide group of people needs to just understand how these ideas work. And understanding how quadratic funding works, and I think we definitely can get people to kind of understand how quadratic funding works in kind of the important sense, but that doesn't necessarily mean teaching everyone kind of square roots and kind of first and second order conditions involving derivatives and kind of diagrams with the squares and diagonals. That could understanding how quadratic funding works could just mean having an intuitive idea that says look, here is the mechanism, and here's what happens if you put in $1. Here's what happens if you kind of put in $5. And just having a kind of an intuitive understanding of the sort that anyone can have about what is this thing and how do you interact with this thing, and that's
and by the way, the same thing is true of American democracy. I mean, how many people in the United States could explain to you? How many people could explain to you what goes on with the Electoral College? Probably 1% of the population.
Yeah, and the other example of this is even money itself, right? If you think about money, how do you know that like $3 is a reasonable price to pay for like a green tea and $37 is not, right? Like, and how do you know that like some number of dollars is an okay price to pay for a car, but not for another thing? If you have $1,000, like how do you even know what you split it on, right? Like these are decisions where if you were forced to just go and make them in a vacuum, then sure, kind of the Homo economicus models would say that like you would do it optimally, but in reality, you would just totally have no idea what the hell you're supposed to do, right? And you'd make lots of mistakes. But if you put people in the context of an existing culture where there's kind of a lot of this experience, both within the person themselves and among other people, about how to kind of deal with this thing called money and this thing called a market, and how and of what kinds of deals are acceptable, what kinds of deals are not acceptable, then suddenly kind of within the context of kind of us working together in this very distributed way, you do get much more rationality. And so, like for any new mechanism, kind of how do you make that leap is the challenge, and it's going to take time.
Now, perhaps one distinction, though, Glenn, is that if you take, let's say, in the context of machine learning and artificial intelligence, the ideas of explainability and interpretability, where yes, the existing monetary system, the financial sector, our system of government itself, the democratic process is highly obscure, highly confusing, even to those participating in it. But at least there's theoretically some capacity to comprehend or to decipher what goes into the black box. So do you think there's just a fundamentally technical difference in comparing the comprehensibility of the systems? Or do you think it's just a matter of degree?
Well, I mean, I think there is, if you go into AI, machine learning systems, there's some pretty big barriers there. But I think the reality is that what the American system is, the systems Vitalik we're talking about, is what I would call complex but not complicated systems. They're systems made up of relatively simple concepts configured in extremely surprising and confusing ways. So no one can really understand the entirety of the system, but they can understand the sort of building blocks, these majority rule type things, or, private property like elements. And I think that they can come to understand things like quadratic voting in a similar fashion. I don't actually think it's all that complicated. I just think it's epsilon more complicated than our current systems. And it requires about the amount of education that people receive in a normal civics class.
Well, that's a particularly challenging bar and context in the United States in particular. But so if you were to, translate, again, the most concrete, tangible, applicable example to someone on why quadratic funding or quadratic voting is the vanguard, the critical innovation, what might that be in sort of?
Well, one good example is, a lot of people talk about ranked choice voting, but the reality is ranked choice voting does not really solve most of the problems that have set us about elections. Look, Donald Trump, yes, he got 48% of the vote and Hillary got whatever amount more than that. But the reality is we shouldn't have had either of those candidates to begin with. Neither of them got a lot of support from the public in terms of how much they actually on net benefited from those candidates. Kasich and Sanders were the candidates in 2016 who got the most net support. So we need a system that allows you to express that rather than just to, have some third party thrown into the mix. We need a way to rule out the people who the most people have strong objections to, and rule in people with broad, and reasonably strong support. And that's what quadratic voting can do. It's a system that can rule out the Nazi and the Communist Party and let in more consensual solutions.
What questions might you have for each other? I'm not sure the kind of issues that you might find.
So, I think one thing that we could talk about is kind of good short-term kind of targets and use cases for things like quadratic funding in kind of broader contexts, right? I mean, I can kind of start off with one example, just kind of the media and journalism, right? Like,
That's my first example too, Vitalik. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, it's a really nice example because, like, first of all, the media and journalism is a public good. You write an article and it's up there on the internet, and anyone can read it. And well, sure, you can put up a paywall, but people can just get around those paywalls. So it is a public good. But on the other hand, it's because it's a public good, that means that if you just rely on markets to fund it, first of all, the funding is going to be insufficient. And second of all, the amount of funding that there is going to be connected to things that are not kind of directly connected to the ultimate goal of kind of providing people things that are valuable for them to hear. And so it's, when you have funding that gets connected to kind of completely unrelated variables, like say, how many clicks an article gets or whatever, like you see where the skew comes from. But on the other hand, it's not something that you want to be funded by technocrats because, society is where the only media is kind of media that's funded by centralized technocrats as well, it has failure modes that kind of we're very aware of, right? And so the thing that Quadratic Funding offers is it basically offers a way of funding media that both kind of gets over these kind of the insufficiency of kind of regular market funding, but at the same time without introducing the risk of centralization.
And what might this this media alternative kind of look like in terms of the user experience, right? Where think
of Patreon, think of any crowdfunding site, except rather than your money just being your money, it gets matched. People are used to matching funds, and it's just a matching fund with a little bit of a different formula. It sounds complicated, it sounds fancy. This is really the sort of thing that I think, honestly, the biggest complication is like signing up for an ETH account, which has driven a lot of people crazy using Gitcoin. But I think that like the actual complexity of the mechanism is minor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even with Gitcoin grants, and we have a section for media, and it's worked pretty well. It's it's funded a lot of kind of media projects that people in the Ethereum community really value. It's funded like YouTube channels, Twitter accounts, blogs, and a lot of different things that, like, for example, the Ethereum Foundation would never have even realized as something that the community really values. And so it's potentially something that would be really cool to try to kind of try out in other contexts, like whether it's local news or like media dedicated to a particular topic, and kind of go from there.
And this sort of generalized system of matching funds, you've collectively coined as liberal radicalism. Now, for someone, for the listener who might hear radicalism and have a particular preconceived notion, how do you conceive of this liberal radicalism that the two of you have kind of coined? Like, what does that translate to? And by contrast to what?
Well, there's a long liberal radical tradition, and Henry George was an important part of it, which on the one hand, as traditional classical liberalism took very seriously the notion of sort of neutrality by the state and centralized authority across different people or components, but that took that even more seriously than classical liberalism did. That was radical in its liberalism because it realized that it wasn't only individuals who the state had to be neutral across, but different community organizations and ways of living. And in that way also responded to the radical critiques of liberalism that it neglected community. So that's a brief summary, but there's many, many different meanings of radicalism, from the actual square roots themselves to a particular historical tradition to it sort of goes on and on.
Yeah, I mean, like the way I would describe it is that it's, first of all, I mean, it's liberal in the sense that it respects freedom and it kind of respects people's ability to kind of shape their own circumstances in a whole bunch of different ways. But and it's radical in the sense that it's not like it's being willing to think big, and it's not just kind of a set of tiny changes and like switch the tax rate over here from 37% to 39% and like tweak this other knob 10 degrees to the left. It's actually thinking of kind of very substantial redesigns to address very substantial challenges. It's also radical in the sense of kind of going back to the roots. So the word radical comes from the Latin radix, which means root. And it's kind of going back to the roots of, I mean, Henry George is one example, and there's a lot of other kind of 19th century and 20th century philosophers. I mean, William Vickery is the other example. And taking a lot of these kind of older ideas and kind of what some of these older people were fighting for, and kind of combining that together with basically what we know in the 21st century and kind of the context of the 21st century. I mean, and then, of course, there is kind of radical as in, well, quadratic funding has a square root in it. So it's all of those things.
Fascinating. Now, Glen, you brought up the frankly sounding existential concern around the Chinese alternative to. Oh, I see we have a comment in the field. The Chinese alternative kind of gaining ground and gaining credence in the context of American institutional failure in the wake of COVID. I mean, in the spirit of avoiding our dystopian technological, narratives, what can we grasp on for a glimpse of hope and opportunity and a path forward in the context of liberal democracy, in the context of a non-authoritarian regime implementing facial recognition technology and social currencies for a particular centralized aim? This way forward in the context of decentralized liberal democracy?
Let me read you the mission statement for Taiwan's digital ministry led by Audrey Tang, someone who Vitalik introduced me to and has become very important to the radical exchange movement. She writes, "When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it an Internet of Beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And when we hear that the singularity is near, let us remember the plurality is here."
Definitely a very beautiful sentiment, and I think, kind of the alternative to basically a kind of pure and rigid technocracy is basically a narrative that is simultaneously kind of tech positive, but it uses. It recognizes the kind of plurality of possibilities and how technology can be used, and it uses that technology in order to kind of achieve freedom, respecting, and kind of democratic and inclusive objectives, right? So,
and it understands the need for a balance between advances in how we organize ourselves and advances in the tools that we have. Albert Einstein, exactly, a big follower of Henry George, ahead of the 1933 disarmament conference, said that if we had advanced as much in our ways of organizing ourselves as we had in our tools, we would all have carefree and happy lives. But that as it is, we've put razor blades into the hands of 3-year-old children. And I think that that's how we have to think about it, is that the more complicated our tools and gadgets are, the more we need to be able to organize ourselves.
Well, this is a really thought-provoking and moving note. I'm really conscious of the time, and so appreciative of the both of you. Really, two geniuses. How lucky are we to collectively organize, to reimagine, to rebuild, to reconstruct new alternatives. So I want to.
We hope you'll be in the vanguard of doing that in one of many organizations, but an important one, the U.S. government soon, Jonathan.
Well, I so appreciate it, because to your point, to both of your points, I mean, one common sentiment I have, it seems, is there's no teleology, there is no natural order, there is no inevitability to the course of events, to human history. There is just people, ideas, and people acting and organizing upon them. And I so appreciate the both of you for helping lead the way.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.